Black man accused of theft in a luxury store. What happened when the police arrived left everyone stunned. Before the story begins, comment below which city you're watching this video from. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Enjoy the story, everyone. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Callender Financial Group headquarters, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor of the executive suite. Marcus Wells stood at the window, his tailored charcoal suit accentuating his tall, athletic frame as he gazed out at the Boston skyline. At 32, he had accomplished what most people could only dream of in a lifetime. "Mr. Wells, the board members are ready for you," his assistant Amelia announced from the doorway. Marcus turned, his confident smile revealing a hint of the determination that had propelled him from a scholarship student to the CEO of one of Boston's most prestigious financial firms. "Thank you, Amelia. I'll be right there." He gathered his presentation materials and took one final glance at his reflection in the glass. The face staring back at him was the same one that had once been told he didn't belong in the halls of Harvard. Now that same face appeared on the cover of Business America as Finance's Rising Star. The boardroom fell silent as Marcus entered, commanding attention without saying a word. Around the table sat 12 of the most influential financial minds in New England, all waiting to hear his proposal for the company's expansion into sustainable energy investments. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his deep voice resonating with authority, "today marks a pivotal moment for Callender Financial. The portfolio I'm about to present doesn't just promise unprecedented returns, it positions us as pioneers in shaping a more equitable financial future." For the next hour, Marcus outlined his vision with precision and passion. By the time he concluded, the board's approval was unanimous. "Brilliant as always, Marcus," said Thomas Caldwell, his mentor and the firm's founding partner, as the room cleared. "You've transformed this company in ways I couldn't have imagined when I took a chance on that determined Harvard grad 5 years ago." Marcus smiled, remembering the day Thomas had offered him the opportunity that changed everything. "You saw something in me that others didn't, Thomas. I'll never forget that." "Nonsense," Thomas waved dismissively. "I simply recognized talent. The rest has been all you." He paused, studying Marcus. "Though I still don't understand why you insist on teaching in Roxbury every Wednesday. A man in your position could write checks instead of spending precious time in a classroom." The question was familiar and Marcus had a practiced response. "Money opens doors, but education transforms lives. I was lucky enough to have mentors who believed in me. Now it's my turn." Thomas shook his head with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. "Well, I suppose it's that conviction that makes you exceptional, Marcus. Just don't forget the cocktail reception tonight. The Peterson account depends on it." "I'll be there," Marcus assured him, glancing at his watch. "But now, if you'll excuse me, I have a class to teach." 45 minutes later, Marcus stepped out of his Tesla in front of the Roxbury Community Center, a worn brick building nestled between a discount furniture store and a boarded-up deli. He'd changed from his designer suit into jeans and a simple button-down shirt, his only remaining symbol of wealth, the platinum watch his team had given him after their first billion-dollar deal. Inside, the classroom was a stark contrast to Callender's sleek offices. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, and mismatched desks were arranged in a semicircle facing a whiteboard covered in financial terms. "Mr. Wells," Elijah Washington, a bright 16-year-old with dreams of becoming an investment banker, was already setting up the day's materials. "I did that stock market simulation you suggested. Started with $1,000 virtual dollars and turned it into $1,500 in 2 weeks. Marcus's face lit up with genuine pride. "That's impressive, Elijah. Better returns than some of my professional traders. Tell me your strategy." As more students filtered in, the energy in the room transformed. Here, Marcus wasn't the CEO of Callender Financial. He was simply Mr. Wells, the finance teacher who believed they could all succeed regardless of their zip code. "Today we're talking about building credit," Marcus announced, writing "financial independence" in bold letters on the whiteboard. "Something they don't teach you in traditional schools, but is fundamental to creating wealth." For the next 2 hours, Marcus guided his students through the complexities of FICO scores, interest rates, and responsible borrowing. He shared personal anecdotes from his own journey, careful to emphasize that success required both opportunity and preparation. "Financial literacy isn't just about making money," he told them as the class concluded. It's about having the freedom to make choices. Remember, wealth isn't measured by what you have, but by what you control. After class, Sofia Martinez, the center's program director, approached him with a grateful smile. You know, these kids talk about you all week long. You're showing them possibilities they never imagined. Marcus helped stack the chairs against the wall, a habit from his own childhood when he'd stayed after school to help teachers who'd gone the extra mile for him. They're doing the hard work. I'm just pointing out the path. Don't sell yourself short, Sofia insisted. You could be anywhere on a Wednesday afternoon, but you choose to be here. That matters. She hesitated before adding, We're organizing a fundraising event next month. Having someone like you speak would make a world of difference. Marcus nodded without hesitation. Send me the details. I'll be there. He shouldered his backpack, now filled with graded financial plans rather than corporate presentations. I should get going. I need to grab something to eat before a business event tonight. There's a new sandwich place around the corner, Sofia suggested. Harmon's Market. They just opened last month. Perfect, I could use a good sandwich. Marcus waved goodbye to the remaining students and stepped out into the late afternoon sun, unaware that his next interaction would shatter the careful balance between the two worlds he navigated so skillfully. Walking the 3 blocks to Harmon's Market, Marcus felt the familiar weight of transition settling over him. In a few hours, he would be back in his other life, champagne flute in hand discussing million-dollar deals. But for now, he was just a hungry teacher looking for a quick meal. The store's bell chimed cheerfully as Marcus pushed open the door, the aroma of fresh bread and coffee welcoming him. A few customers browsed the aisles, and a young white man with a backpack similar to Marcus's was selecting energy drinks from a refrigerated section. Behind the counter stood Richard Harmon, a man in his 50s with graying hair and tired eyes that had seen too many disappointments. His expression shifted subtly as Marcus walked toward the prepared food section, a change so slight that most would miss it, but one Marcus had grown accustomed to recognizing. Marcus selected a turkey sandwich and a bottled water, then approached the counter, already anticipating the interaction that was about to unfold. As he set his items down, Richard's gaze traveled from Marcus's face to the backpack slung over his shoulder, and the familiar dance began. You'll need to leave that backpack by the door, Richard Harmon said, gesturing to a small rack near the entrance. Marcus glanced over his shoulder at the white customer with an identical backpack who was now examining the chip selection. I noticed that gentleman is carrying his backpack in the store. Richard's jaw tightened. That's different. He's a regular, and I could become one too, Marcus replied with practiced calm, the kind he'd developed over years of similar encounters. I just need a sandwich first. The store owner's eyes narrowed. Look, buddy, we've had some issues with shoplifting lately. I'm just being cautious about who I let wander around my store with bags. The emphasis on who wasn't lost on Marcus. He'd heard the same insinuation in boardrooms, disguised as concerns about his cultural fit, and in real estate offices where available properties mysteriously became just sold when he arrived for viewings. I understand caution, Marcus said, maintaining his composed demeanor. But it should be applied equally, don't you think? Richard's face flushed. Are you accusing me of something? I'm trying to run a business here. If you don't want to follow store policy, you can shop somewhere else. The other customer approached the counter, placing several items next to Marcus's sandwich. Richard smiled warmly at him. Hey, Jake, how's it going? Your usual today? Yeah, thanks, Mr. Harmon, Jake replied, subtly sliding a candy bar into his jacket pocket, while Richard's attention was fixed on Marcus. Marcus caught the movement, but remained focused on the immediate situation. I'm not trying to cause trouble, he said to Richard. I just want to purchase this sandwich and be on my way. Fine, Richard huffed, ringing up the items. But I'll be watching you. As Marcus reached for his wallet, the platinum Calanda corporate card caught the fluorescent light. Richard's eyes widened in suspicion. Where did you get that? He demanded, his tone shifting from annoyance to accusation. Marcus met his gaze steadily. It's my company card. Right, Richard scoffed. Calendar Financial just hands out platinum cards to guys like you. The store had grown quieter, other customers now watching the interaction unfold. Marcus felt the familiar pressure building, the tightrope walk between standing his ground and not becoming another angry black man in someone's story. I don't appreciate what you're implying, Marcus said, his voice level but firm. Please complete my transaction so I can leave your establishment. Richard folded his arms across his chest. I think you should leave now, without the sandwich. In fact, I'm going to need to see what's in that backpack before you go anywhere. Sophia Martinez chose that moment to enter the store, immediately sensing the tension. Marcus, is everything okay? Richard turned to her. You know this guy, Sophia? Of course I do, she replied, confused by the hostility. This is Marcus Wells. He teaches financial literacy at the community center. Richard's expression remained skeptical. Well, your teacher here was trying to use what I'm pretty sure is a stolen credit card, and he refused to leave his backpack at the door, unlike other customers. Sophia's eyes flashed with indignation. That's ridiculous, Richard. Marcus is... It's okay, Sophia, Marcus interrupted gently. 5 years of building calendar had taught him when to fight and when to walk away. This wasn't worth escalating. I'll get something else later. As he turned to leave, Jake hurriedly paid for his items and rushed toward the exit, bumping into a display near the door. Several packages tumbled to the floor, and in the commotion, a store security tag beeped loudly. Richard sprang from behind the counter. Stop right there, he shouted, but his eyes swept immediately to Marcus, standing nowhere near the alarm. The security system continued beeping as Jake froze, his expression a mixture of guilt and fear. Empty your pockets, Richard demanded, addressing Marcus despite the alarm having triggered when Jake passed it. You can't be serious, Marcus said, the careful composure beginning to crack. The alarm went off when he walked by, not me. Just empty them, Richard insisted, his face reddening. The few remaining customers watched in uncomfortable silence as Marcus slowly removed his wallet, keys, and phone, placing them on a nearby counter. Satisfied? Richard turned to Jake. You too, just to be fair. Reluctantly, Jake emptied his pockets, revealing the stolen candy bar among his purchases. Richard's face fell as realization dawned. I was going to pay for that, Jake stammered unconvincingly. Must have forgotten it was in my pocket. Richard looked between Jake and Marcus, embarrassment finally replacing suspicion. There seems to have been a misunderstanding. Yes, Marcus agreed, his voice cool as he gathered his belongings. There certainly has been. Sophia stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Marcus's arm. Richard, do you have any idea who you just accused of theft? Sophia, please, Marcus murmured, not wanting his identity revealed. In this moment, the principal mattered more than his status, but Sophia was too angry to stop. This man you're treating like a criminal is Marcus Wells, the CEO of Calander Financial Group, the same company that provided the small business loan that helped you open this store in the first place. The color drained from Richard's face as he looked at Marcus with new eyes, suddenly seeing beyond the casual clothes to the confident posture and articulate speech he'd chosen to ignore. Mr. Wells, I had no idea. I never meant to. You never meant to what, Mr. Harmon? Marcus asked, his voice quiet but penetrating. You never meant to accuse me specifically of theft, or you never meant to make assumptions based on my appearance. Richard fumbled for words. Please understand, we've had problems with shoplifting. I was just being careful. Selectively careful, Marcus corrected him. The real thief was right in front of you, but you were too busy profiling me to notice. By now, Jake had slipped out the door, forgotten in the unfolding drama between the store owner and the unexpectedly influential man he'd wronged. Richard's desperation became palpable as the implications of his actions began to sink in. Mr. Wells, please accept my sincere apologies. If there's anything I can do to make this right, there is, Marcus interrupted, his decision already made. How you can expect a call from Calander's small business division tomorrow regarding your loan? Richard blanched. What do you mean? We regularly review our community investments to ensure they align with our company values, Marcus explained, his professional tone returning. Respect and equal treatment are foundational to those values. You can't, Richard began, then stopped himself, realizing he had no leverage here. I can, Marcus confirmed. And I will. As Marcus turned to leave, Richard called after him, panic evident in his voice. Please, Mr. Wells, this store is everything to me. I've sunk my life savings into it. My family depends on this business. Marcus paused at the door, feeling the weight of the power he now held over Richard's future. It wasn't a position he'd sought, but one thrust upon him by Richard's own actions. "You should have thought about that before deciding some customers deserve respect, while others deserve suspicion," he said, pushing the door open to the cool evening air. Outside, Sophia hurried to keep pace with Marcus's long strides. "That was incredible," she said, admiration evident in her voice. He had it coming. Marcus slowed, suddenly feeling the emotional toll of the confrontation. "It's not about what he had coming, Sophia. It's about what happens next." "What do you mean?" "I mean," Marcus explained, "that while Richard's behavior was inexcusable, my response carries responsibility too. If I pull Calander's support, it doesn't just affect him. It affects his employees, his family, this community." Sophia studied him thoughtfully. "So what will you do?" Marcus checked his watch, remembering the cocktail reception that now seemed trivial compared to the decision before him. "I don't know yet, but I promise you this, whatever happens next will be about justice, not revenge." As they parted ways, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that today's encounter was about to set in motion events that would force both him and Richard Harmon to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and the society they navigated so differently. Back at his penthouse apartment, Marcus exchanged his casual clothes for an impeccably tailored tuxedo, the transformation into the business titan complete once more. But as he adjusted his cufflinks, his father's, the only inheritance from a man who'd worked 2 jobs to put his son through college, his mind remained in that small store in Roxbury. His phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. "Where are you?" "Peterson asking about you." Marcus texted back a quick reassurance that he was on his way, but instead of immediately leaving, he sat on the edge of his bed, opening his laptop to search for information about Harmon's market. The results painted a picture he'd suspected but needed to confirm. A struggling small business, the owner's life savings invested, a loan from Calander's community development program that had been approved just before Marcus joined the company. If he pulled the financing, the store would almost certainly fail. Richard Harmon would lose everything. The justice Marcus had promised Sophia now seemed more complicated than the righteous certainty he'd felt in the moment. He closed the laptop, the decision still unresolved as he headed for the reception, where Boston's elite awaited, unaware of the turmoil beneath his composed exterior. The Peterson reception buzzed with the polite laughter and strategic conversations of Boston's financial elite. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the gathering, where deals worth millions were casually discussed between sips of champagne. Marcus moved through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries, while part of his mind remained fixed on the incident at Harmon's market. "There he is." Thomas Caldwell appeared at Marcus's side, clapping him on the shoulder. "I was beginning to think you'd stood us up. James Peterson has been asking about you all evening." Marcus forced a smile. "Sorry for the delay. Had a situation to handle." Thomas raised an eyebrow but didn't press further as he guided Marcus toward a distinguished man in his 60s whose investment portfolio could potentially double Calander's sustainable energy fund. "James, let me introduce you to the genius behind our new initiative," Thomas said. "Marcus Wells, our CEO and the youngest financial strategist to make the Forbes 30 Under 30 list while still in his 20s. James Peterson extended his hand, his grip firm. "So you're the wunderkind everyone's talking about. Thomas tells me you've found a way to make ethical investing actually profitable. I'm skeptical but intrigued." For the next 30 minutes, Marcus outlined his vision with the same passion he'd shown the board that morning, temporarily setting aside the weight of his encounter with Richard Harmon. By the time he finished, Peterson was nodding appreciatively. "You've given me something to think about, young man," he said. "Send over the prospectus tomorrow and we'll continue this conversation." As Peterson moved on to greet other guests, Thomas handed Marcus a glass of scotch. "Whatever had you distracted when you arrived, it clearly didn't affect your pitch. Peterson doesn't impress easily." Marcus took a sip, the smoky liquid burning a path down his throat. "Have you ever had a day where worlds collide, Thomas? Where you can't keep the compartments of your life separate anymore?" Thomas studied him curiously. "This sounds more serious than your usual philosophical musings. What happened today?" Marcus hesitated, then recounted the incident at the store, watching Thomas's expression shift from disbelief to indignation. "So pull the loan," Thomas said when Marcus finished. It's a straightforward business decision. We don't support establishments that discriminate. It's not that simple, Marcus replied. This isn't a corporate entity with deep pockets. It's one man who made a terrible mistake, but whose family and employees will suffer if I react punitively. Thomas shook his head. Always the teacher looking for the learning opportunity. Sometimes, Marcus, people don't deserve second chances. Maybe not, Marcus conceded. But I'm not sure I'm the one who should be making that judgment. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Catherine Chen, Calander's chief legal counsel, elegant in a midnight blue gown that contrasted with her straightforward manner. Sorry to intrude, she said after exchanging greetings, but I thought you should know there's a social media situation developing. Someone named Sophia Martinez posted about an incident involving you at a store in Roxbury. It's gaining traction. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. Of course, Sophia would share the story. To her, it represented a moment of justice, a powerful man standing up against everyday discrimination. Catherine continued, The post doesn't mention Calander directly, but people are making the connection. We should issue a statement before this spins into a PR issue. No, Marcus decided. No statements yet. Let me handle this personally. Catherine looked skeptical. Marcus, while I admire your hands-on approach, this could quickly become about more than one store owner's actions. It could impact our reputation, our community initiatives. I understand the implications, Marcus interrupted gently, but this situation requires a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. Give me until tomorrow to resolve it. Catherine and Thomas exchanged concerned glances, but acquiesced. Marcus had earned their trust, even when his methods diverged from conventional corporate responses. As the reception continued around him, Marcus checked Sophia's post. The story had indeed gained traction, with hundreds of shares and comments ranging from outrage on his behalf to calls for boycotting Harmon's Market. Some commenters were already connecting the dots to Calander Financial, speculating about potential repercussions for the store. Marcus scrolled through the comments, recognizing the familiar pattern of social media justice: swift, absolute, and often disproportionate. Regardless of Richard Harmon's actions, did he deserve to have his livelihood destroyed by an online mob? Would that change anything or simply reinforce the cycles of resentment and division? A new notification appeared on his phone, a direct message from Richard Harmon himself, somehow having found Marcus's profile. Mr. Wells, I know no apology can undo my inexcusable behavior today. I've spent the evening reflecting on my actions, and am ashamed of how I treated you. If you're willing, I would appreciate the opportunity to apologize in person and discuss how I might make amends. This isn't about the loan, though I won't pretend that isn't a concern, but about taking responsibility for my actions. You deserve that much at minimum. Marcus stared at the message, surprised by its tone of genuine remorse rather than mere panic. He typed a brief response. Tomorrow, 8 a.m. at the community center. We'll talk. Pocketing his phone, Marcus rejoined the reception with renewed focus. He'd made his decision. Tomorrow would determine whether it was the right one. The following morning found Marcus at the community center an hour before his meeting with Richard. The building was quiet, most staff and participants not due to arrive until later. He'd chosen this neutral ground deliberately, a place where both he and Richard were visitors, neither having home field advantage. I didn't expect to see you today, Sophia said, entering the small conference room where Marcus had set up, especially not after you became a local hero overnight. Marcus smiled wryly. That wasn't my intention. I know, she said, setting down 2 cups of coffee and taking a seat across from him. But your confrontation with Richard struck a chord. People are tired of these everyday indignities. I understand that better than most, Marcus replied, but I didn't come here to become a symbol or to destroy a man's business. I came for a sandwich. Sophia studied him. You're planning to forgive him, aren't you? I'm planning to listen, Marcus corrected her. What happens after that depends on what I hear. She leaned forward, her expression earnest. Just remember that your decision affects more than just you and Richard. It sends a message about what's acceptable and what isn't. I'm well aware of that responsibility, Marcus said, the weight of it evident in his voice. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Richard Harmon stood in the doorway, looking as though he hadn't slept. His usually tidy appearance was disheveled, his eyes bloodshot. Mr. Wells, he began, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Marcus gestured to the empty chair. "Please, sit down." Sophia excused herself, giving Richard a cold glance as she left that made it clear where her sympathies lay. For a moment, the two men sat in silence, the power dynamics between them dramatically reversed from their encounter at the store. "I spent the night reading about you," Richard finally said. "Your journey from South Boston to Harvard, building Calander into what it is today. Your work here at the center." He paused, swallowing hard. "I keep asking myself how I could have been so blind, how I could have looked at you and seen only what my prejudices told me to see." Marcus remained silent, allowing Richard the space to continue. "I could give you excuses," Richard went on. "Tell you about the shoplifting problems we've had, the struggle to keep the store afloat in a changing neighborhood, but none of that justifies how I treated you. The truth is," his voice faltered, "the truth is that I acted on biases I didn't even realize I was carrying until I saw them reflected back at me through your eyes." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "Why did you open that store in Roxbury, Mr. Harmon? There are certainly easier places to run a business." The question seemed to surprise Richard. "My wife grew up there. Her parents owned a small grocery store on that same block for 30 years before rising rents forced them out. When they passed away, we decided to use our savings and the loan from Calander to bring something back to the community. At least, that's what we told ourselves." He sighed heavily. "But maybe part of me always saw myself as some kind of savior, not as a member of the community I serve. That's the kind of thinking that led to yesterday." Marcus nodded, sensing the genuine reflection behind Richard's words. "Do you know what struck me most about our interaction yesterday, Mr. Harmon? It wasn't the initial suspicion. I've experienced that too many times to count. It was your certainty that I couldn't possibly be who I said I was, even when presented with evidence to the contrary." Richard flinched but didn't look away. "You're right, and I can't undo that moment or the hurt it caused. All I can do is acknowledge it was wrong and commit to changing, not just my actions but the thinking behind them." "And if I hadn't been Marcus Wells, CEO," Marcus pressed, "if I'd just been another black man in your store with a backpack, would my dignity have mattered less then?" Richard's face flushed with shame. "Before yesterday, I might have given you the answer I thought you wanted to hear. Today, I can only promise you that I'm asking myself that same question, and I don't like the answer I'm finding." The honesty of the response resonated with Marcus. He'd heard enough polished apologies in boardrooms to recognize the difference between damage control and genuine remorse. "Mr. Harmon," Marcus said after a long moment of consideration, "I haven't decided yet about the loan, but I do have a proposal for you." Richard straightened in his chair, his expression a mixture of apprehension and cautious hope. "I'm listening, Mr. Wells." Marcus folded his hands on the table, his demeanor shifting subtly from the wronged individual to the strategic businessman. "Calander Financial has a community engagement program where we partner with local businesses to provide financial literacy workshops. These businesses offer their spaces after hours, and in return, they receive marketing support, networking opportunities, and potential investment consideration." Richard nodded slowly, trying to follow where this was leading. "I propose that Harmon's Market becomes our newest partner location," Marcus continued. "You would host weekly evening workshops for local residents, particularly young adults and small business owners from underserved communities. I would personally teach the first series of classes." Understanding dawned on Richard's face. "You want me to open my store to the very community I've been unconsciously pushing away?" "Precisely," Marcus confirmed. "This isn't punishment, Mr. Harmon. It's an opportunity for you to rebuild trust, for community members to access valuable financial knowledge, and for your business to form meaningful local connections." Richard seemed genuinely surprised by the direction of the conversation. "That's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious. "Public humiliation, financial ruin. At minimum, the termination of our loan agreement," Richard admitted, his voice low. "I wouldn't have blamed you." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "Destroying your business won't erase what happened yesterday. It won't change the systemic issues that led to that moment. But transforming your store from a place of suspicion to a center for community empowerment, that could actually make a difference." Richard considered the proposal, uncertainty evident in his expression. "Do you really believe people will come?" After what I did? After what's being said about me online. That depends largely on you, Marcus replied honestly, on whether they see genuine change or just damage control. He paused, then added, "Redemption isn't granted, Mr. Harmon. It's earned day by day, interaction by interaction." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Sophia peeked in, her expression guarded. "Sorry to interrupt, but your 9 o'clock students are starting to arrive, Marcus. And there's someone else here to see you both." She opened the door wider to reveal a young black woman in her early 20s, professionally dressed with a laptop bag slung over her shoulder. Her resolute expression suggested she wasn't here by coincidence. "Zoe?" Richard's surprise was evident. "What are you doing here?" Marcus looked between them, raising an eyebrow in question. "This is my daughter, Zoe Harmon," Richard explained, his discomfort palpable. "She's a journalism student at Boston University." Zoe stepped into the room, her posture straight and determined. "I'm here as a journalist, not as your daughter." She addressed Marcus directly, extending her hand. "Mr. Wells, I'm writing a piece on racial profiling in retail establishments for the BU student newspaper. When I heard about what happened with my father, I believe it would make a powerful centerpiece for the article." The tension in the room thickened as Richard stared at his daughter in disbelief. "Zoe, this is a private matter." "No, Dad, it's not," she interrupted firmly. "It's part of a pattern that happens every day across this city, across this country. The only difference is that this time, the person you profiled happened to be in a position of power." Marcus observed the family dynamic with interest, recognizing the courage it took for Zoe to confront her father publicly. "Please, join us," he offered, gesturing to an empty chair. Sophia hesitated at the door. "Should I reschedule your class?" "No," Marcus decided. "But give us 15 minutes before sending the students in." As Sophia left, Zoe set up her laptop, her movements efficient and professional, despite the emotionally charged situation. "Mr. Wells, I'd like to record this conversation, if that's all right with you." Before Marcus could respond, Richard interjected, "Zoe, I understand you're doing your job, but this isn't the appropriate time." "When is the appropriate time to discuss discrimination, Dad?" Zoe challenged, years of unspoken frustration evident in her tone. "When it's happening to your customers? To your daughter's friends? To me?" Richard fell silent, the implication of her words hitting him like a physical blow. Marcus watched the exchange with compassion for both parties. "I'm willing to be interviewed, Ms. Harmon, but I think there's a bigger story developing here than the one you came for." Zoe tilted her head questioningly. "What do you mean?" "Your father and I were just discussing a potential partnership," Marcus explained. "One that could transform Harmon's Market into a community education center for financial literacy." Zoe looked skeptical. "So you're not pursuing consequences for his actions?" "I believe I am," Marcus replied calmly. "Just not the punitive kind you might be expecting. Sometimes the most effective consequence is being required to engage directly with the community you've harmed." Richard turned to his daughter, his voice thick with emotion. "Zoe, I know we haven't talked much about these issues. Maybe that's part of the problem. I told myself I was colorblind, that I treated everyone the same. Yesterday showed me that wasn't true." Zoe's professional composure wavered slightly at her father's unexpected admission. "You've never said anything like that before." "I've never been forced to confront it before," Richard responded honestly. "It took Mr. Wells holding up a mirror to make me see what was always there." Marcus observed their interaction with growing interest. This conversation was exposing layers of complexity he hadn't anticipated. "Ms. Harmon, what if your article could document more than just another incident of profiling? What if it could chronicle a process of accountability and transformation?" Zoe considered his words thoughtfully. "You mean follow the implementation of this partnership? Document whether it actually leads to meaningful change?" "Exactly," Marcus confirmed. "Most stories like this end with public shaming and then fade from memory. Nothing systemic changes. But what if we tried something different here? What if your article became the first chapter in an ongoing narrative about what happens when we choose education over punishment?" Richard looked between his daughter and Marcus, a flicker of hope visible beneath his shame. "I deserve whatever consequences come my way, but I also want to make things right if that's still possible. That's what we're trying to determine, Marcus replied. Zoe closed her laptop, her journalistic instincts clearly recognizing the potential of this unexpected angle. A longitudinal piece tracking actual efforts at reconciliation and community building would be unprecedented. It could actually contribute something valuable to the conversation. She turned to her father, professional distance momentarily giving way to personal concern. But Dad, this would mean opening yourself up completely. Every uncomfortable revelation, every misstep in the learning process, all of it would be documented. Richard nodded slowly. If that's what it takes to hold me accountable, then yes, I'll do it. Marcus smiled slightly at the unexpected development. Then it seems we have the beginnings of an agreement. Mr. Harmon provides space for financial literacy workshops, participates in community engagement initiatives, and submits to the transparent documentation of this process. In return, Calanda Financial maintains its loan support and provides resources for the educational programs. The door opened again as Sophia returned with Elijah and several other students from Marcus's class. They paused at the threshold, sensing the tension in the room. Mr. Wells? Elijah asked uncertainly. Should we come back later? Marcus exchanged glances with Richard and Zoe, then made a spontaneous decision. Actually, your timing is perfect. Mr. Harmon here is considering hosting financial literacy workshops at his store. I'd value your input on what topics would be most beneficial for the community. Elijah and the other students entered cautiously, their curious gazes moving between the three adults. Wait, said one student, a young woman named Desiree. Isn't Harmon the store owner from that viral post, the one who profiled you? The directness of the question hung in the air. Marcus looked to Richard, giving him the opportunity to respond for himself. Richard stood, visibly uncomfortable but determined. Yes, that was me. I made assumptions about Mr. Wells based solely on his appearance, and I was wrong, inexcusably wrong. Now I'm trying to figure out how to make amends. The students exchanged surprised glances, clearly not expecting such candor. Elijah stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. My grandmother always says that when you know better, you do better. If you're really trying to do better, that matters. It's a start, Desiree acknowledged, though her tone remained skeptical. But it takes more than words. That's exactly what I'm counting on, Marcus agreed, which is why I'd like your help designing workshops that would genuinely benefit our community. As the conversation evolved into a planning session, with students offering increasingly enthusiastic suggestions for financial education topics, Marcus observed the unexpected connections forming in the room. Richard, initially stiff and defensive, gradually began engaging with the students' ideas, asking questions and taking notes. Zoe watched her father with a complex mixture of journalistic detachment and personal hope. By the time the impromptu meeting concluded, the outline of a comprehensive community financial literacy program had taken shape, with Harmon's Market as its headquarters and the students as its first participants and eventual peer educators. As everyone began to disperse, Richard approached Marcus privately. Thank you for this opportunity, Mr. Wells. I know I don't deserve it. This isn't about what you deserve, Marcus replied. It's about what creates the most positive change for the most people. Sometimes that means taking the harder path than simple retribution. Richard nodded, then hesitated before asking, May I ask you a personal question? You can ask, Marcus replied with a slight smile. Have you always been this forgiving? Marcus considered the question seriously. I wouldn't call it forgiveness, exactly. More like strategic optimism. Throughout my life, I've had to decide whether to channel my energy into fighting individual battles or changing the systems that create those battles in the first place. Usually, I choose the latter. As Richard absorbed these words, Zoe approached them, her journalist's notebook in hand. I've been thinking about the framework for my article. What if we titled it, Beyond Calling Out, a new model for community accountability? Marcus nodded appreciatively. I like it. It acknowledges the wrong without defining either of us solely by that moment. As they continued discussing possibilities, Thomas Caldwell unexpectedly appeared in the doorway, his bespoke suit distinctly out of place in the community center setting. Marcus, he called, his expression perplexed. Catherine told me I might find you here. We have the Peterson contract ready, but you haven't been answering your phone. His gaze traveled curiously over Richard, Zoe, and the departing students. What exactly is happening here? Marcus smiled, recognizing that his carefully compartmentalized worlds were colliding once again. But this time, rather than tension, he felt a strange sense of integration, as if pieces of his identity were finally aligning. "Thomas," he said, "let me introduce you to our newest community partners. We've been developing something I think you'll find very interesting." 6 weeks after the confrontation at Harmon's Market, the store's transformation was remarkable. The once sterile convenience store now featured a welcoming community bulletin board near the entrance, displaying financial tips, job opportunities, and announcements for upcoming workshops. The back section had been renovated into a modest but functional classroom space, complete with a digital projector, donated by Calendar Financial. On this particular evening, Marcus stood at the front of this classroom, concluding the final session of the inaugural Financial Literacy Series. 25 community members, ranging from teenagers to retirees, watched attentively as he explained the intricacies of building business credit. "Remember," Marcus emphasized, "financial institutions don't just evaluate your ability to take on debt. They assess your ability to use that debt productively. That's the difference between consuming credit and investing it." In the back of the room, Richard Harmon leaned against the wall, listening as intently as any student. Over the weeks, he had transformed from reluctant host to active participant, his initial discomfort giving way to genuine engagement with the material and the people. "That concludes our 6-week foundation course," Marcus announced as the session wound down. "Next month, we'll begin specialized tracks: entrepreneurship, home ownership, and investment fundamentals. You can sign up tonight before you leave." As participants gathered their materials and approached the registration table, Richard moved toward the front to join Marcus. "Full house again," Richard observed, surveying the animated discussions taking place throughout the room. "When we started this, I honestly thought people would boycott anything associated with me." Marcus smiled. "People are remarkably willing to engage when they see authentic effort to make things right. Your consistent presence and participation made a difference." "Speaking of making a difference," Richard said, lowering his voice slightly, "I read Zoe's first article this morning. She didn't pull any punches about my behavior." "Did you expect her to?" Marcus asked. Richard shook his head. "No, and I wouldn't have wanted her to. Truth is essential to this whole process." He paused, a hint of pride entering his voice. Her professor called it the most nuanced exploration of accountability journalism he's seen from an undergraduate. She's already planning the follow-up piece on community response. Their conversation was interrupted by Elijah, who approached with an older woman at his side. "Mr. Wells, Mr. Harmon, this is my grandmother, Ms. Washington. She wants to talk to you about the home ownership track." Ms. Washington, a dignified woman in her 60s, extended her hand first to Marcus, then, after a brief hesitation, to Richard. "My grandson hasn't stopped talking about these classes, says you're teaching things they never covered in his school." "That's unfortunately common," Marcus acknowledged. "Our educational system rarely prioritizes financial literacy, especially in underserved communities." "Well, I've been renting the same apartment for 23 years, Ms. Washington said. "Paid enough to buy the building twice over. Maybe it's not too late to learn how to make my money work for me instead of my landlord." Richard stepped forward. "The home ownership track would be perfect for you, Ms. Washington, and we've partnered with Calander's mortgage division to provide specialized consultations for program participants." Marcus observed this interaction with satisfaction. Richard was no longer just hosting the program. He was actively advocating for it, connecting community members with resources they might otherwise never access. As the evening continued, Thomas Caldwell made a surprise appearance, arriving just as the last participants were leaving. Despite his initial skepticism about the program, Thomas had become an unexpected ally, securing additional corporate support when interest exceeded their initial capacity. "Looks like another successful session," Thomas noted, shaking hands with Richard. The formality between them had softened over the weeks, though a certain guardedness remained. "The board is impressed with the participation metrics. They're considering expanding the model to other neighborhoods." "We've barely scratched the surface of the need," Marcus replied. "Every session reveals how much more we could be doing." As they discussed expansion possibilities, Marcus noticed Sofia Martinez entering with an unusually serious expression. She made a beeline for their small group, tablet in hand. "Marcus, you need to see this," she said without preamble, turning the screen toward them. It displayed a social media post from a local community activist group. "Corporate whitewashing at Harmons Market. How Calanda Financial is helping a racist store owner rehabilitate his image without real consequences. Protest planned for Saturday, 2 p.m. A heavy silence fell over the group as they absorbed the implications. Richard's face drained of color, while Thomas's expression hardened into the defensive posture of a corporate executive anticipating a PR crisis. "Well," Thomas said finally, "this was inevitable. Public memory is short, but social media never forgets. We should prepare a statement distancing Calanda from—" "No," Marcus interrupted firmly. "We're not distancing ourselves from anything. This program is exactly what it appears to be, an attempt to create meaningful change rather than performative punishment." "Marcus," Thomas warned, "the activist community can be relentless. If they paint Calanda as complicit in whitewashing discrimination, it could affect our standing in the community, not to mention our ESG rankings." Richard cleared his throat. "Perhaps I should step back from the program. The last thing I want is to damage what we've built here." Marcus shook his head decisively. That would only reinforce the narrative that this was about image rather than impact. "No, we need to engage directly with the concerns." "How?" Sophia asked. "These groups have already decided this is corporate window dressing." Marcus considered the question, his strategic mind already mapping potential approaches. "By inviting them in, transparency is our greatest asset here." He turned to Richard. "Are you willing to face direct questioning from community activists about your actions and this program?" Richard hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Yes, it won't be comfortable, but it's necessary." "Good," Marcus said. "Then instead of waiting for Saturday's protest, we'll invite the organizers to a community forum tomorrow evening. Give them a platform to voice their concerns and us an opportunity to address them honestly." Thomas looked skeptical. "That's risky, Marcus. Uncontrolled public forums can quickly become hostile." "Sometimes risk is necessary for real progress," Marcus replied. "Besides, we have nothing to hide. This program is already showing tangible benefits for participants." As the others discussed logistics, Zoe Harmon arrived, having received an urgent text from her father. After being briefed on the situation, she offered an unexpected perspective. "I know some of the people in this activist group," she revealed. "They're not wrong to be skeptical. How many times have we seen corporations use diversity initiatives or community programs as damage control without addressing underlying issues? So what would convince them this is different?" Marcus asked. Zoe considered the question thoughtfully. "Evidence of genuine change, both institutional and personal, and a clear acknowledgement that this program doesn't erase or excuse what happened, but represents an attempt to create something constructive from it. Then that's what we'll present," Marcus decided. "Not as a defense, but as an invitation to make this initiative stronger through their input." The following evening, the classroom space at Harmons Market was reconfigured for the community forum. Chairs were arranged in a circle rather than rows, eliminating physical hierarchies. Marcus had deliberately chosen not to wear his usual business attire, opting instead for the casual clothes he typically wore when teaching. The tension was palpable as community members began to arrive, including several wearing t-shirts with the logo of the activist group that had planned the protest. Marcus recognized some faces from social media posts critical of the program, their expressions ranging from skeptical to openly hostile. Alicia Reynolds, the lead organizer, entered last, her commanding presence drawing all eyes. A respected community advocate with a history of challenging corporate initiatives in underserved neighborhoods, she had been particularly vocal about the Harmons Market partnership. "Thank you all for coming," Marcus began once everyone was seated. "We've called this forum because we believe your concerns deserve to be heard and addressed directly, not dismissed or managed through PR statements." Alicia leaned forward. "Let's be clear about something from the start, Mr. Wells. While many of us respect your individual accomplishments, Calanda Financial doesn't exactly have a spotless record when it comes to truly serving communities like ours, and Mr. Harmon's actions reflect the everyday racism many of us face. So forgive us if we're skeptical about this sudden partnership. Richard flinched slightly at the directness, but didn't look away. Skepticism is warranted, Marcus acknowledged. I share it myself about many corporate initiatives. That's why I want to be transparent about both our intentions and our results so far. For the next hour, Marcus and Richard fielded increasingly pointed questions about the program. How were participants selected? Who controlled the curriculum? What metrics were being used to measure success? How was Calanda benefiting financially? Why wasn't Richard facing more severe consequences? Throughout the questioning, Marcus maintained his composure, neither defensive nor patronizing, while Richard displayed a vulnerability that surprised many, openly acknowledging his failures and the ongoing nature of his education. The atmosphere began to shift when program participants themselves started speaking up, describing the concrete benefits they'd already experienced from the financial literacy classes. Ms. Washington rose to her feet, her dignified presence commanding attention. I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, and I know empty promises when I see them. This program isn't that. For the first time, I understand how mortgage approval actually works. At 65, I'm finally in the process of buying my first home because of what I learned here. Elijah followed with his own testimony. Before these classes, I thought financial success was about luck or connections. Now I understand it's also about knowledge that's been deliberately kept from communities like ours. As more participants shared their experiences, the energy in the room evolved from confrontation to critical engagement. Even Alicia's questions became more constructive, focusing on how to strengthen the program rather than discredit it. Near the forum's conclusion, Zoe, who had been quietly documenting the proceedings, raised her hand to speak. As a journalist covering this story, and as Richard Harmon's daughter, I've had a unique perspective on this process, she began. What I've observed isn't corporate rehabilitation or easy forgiveness. It's something much more difficult, the messy, uncomfortable work of actual accountability. She looked directly at her father. My dad's actions that day weren't surprising to me. They reflected attitudes I'd heard at our dinner table, assumptions that went unchallenged because they were so normalized. What has surprised me is watching him confront those assumptions publicly, repeatedly, even when it's painful. Turning to address Alicia and the other activists, she continued, I understand your skepticism, but I've been documenting this process from the beginning, with complete editorial independence. What I've seen is an approach to addressing discrimination that focuses on systemic change rather than individual punishment. As the forum wound down, Alicia approached Marcus privately. You've given me something to think about, Mr. Wells. This isn't what I expected. What did you expect? Marcus asked, echoing the question he'd posed to Richard weeks earlier. The usual corporate performance, she replied frankly. Carefully managed optics, symbolic gestures, lots of promises without accountability. And now? Alicia studied him thoughtfully. Now I'm cautiously interested. This model, focusing on economic empowerment rather than simply diversity training, addresses root causes in a way most initiatives don't. But, she added firmly, we'll still be watching closely. I would expect nothing less, Marcus replied with genuine respect. As the last attendees departed, leaving only the core team behind, Thomas approached Marcus with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. I've been in corporate America for 30 years, he said, shaking his head slightly, and I've never seen anyone voluntarily walk into that kind of fire and emerge not just unscathed, but having changed minds. Marcus smiled tiredly. Not all minds were changed, but enough to keep building. Richard, who had been speaking with his daughter, joined them. The protest is officially cancelled, he reported. Alicia just announced it online. They're redirecting their energy toward expanding the program to include civil rights education alongside financial literacy. A fair addition, Marcus acknowledged. Financial knowledge without an understanding of the policies and practices that created wealth disparities is incomplete. As they began cleaning up the space, Richard paused, a question clearly weighing on his mind. Marcus, can I ask you something personal? Of course. After all these weeks, after seeing real change happening here, do you regret not pursuing more punitive consequences for what I did? Marcus considered the question carefully, aware that everyone in the room had stopped to listen for his answer. No, he said finally. Punishment might have satisfied a certain need for justice, but it wouldn't have created all this. He gestured to the classroom where so many had begun journeys toward financial independence. That said, he continued with subtle emphasis, this approach required your complete commitment to the process. Without that, we would have been having a very different conversation about consequences. Richard nodded, understanding the unspoken message. The path they'd chosen had been conditional on his willingness to engage authentically, not a free pass. As they finished restoring the space for the next day's business, Marcus noticed Sophia watching him with a curious expression. "What?" he asked. "I was just thinking about that day in the store," she replied. "How differently this all could have gone if you'd made a different choice in that moment." Marcus glanced around at the transformed space, not just physically renovated, but reimagined in purpose. One moment of discrimination created an opportunity for systemic change. That's the irony, isn't it? Sometimes our worst moments can become catalysts for our best work. Little did Marcus know that this philosophy would soon be tested in ways he couldn't imagine, as forces beyond their small community began taking notice of the unusual partnership forming in the heart of Roxbury. 3 months after the community forum, Marcus stood at the podium in Harvard Business School's largest lecture hall, facing an audience of students, faculty, and business leaders. Behind him, a large screen displayed the title of his presentation, Beyond Token Responses, Reimagining Corporate Social Responsibility. The traditional approach to addressing discrimination has been reactive and individualized, Marcus explained, his voice carrying confidently through the hall. Someone commits an offensive act. Public outrage follows. The person is fired or otherwise penalized. Everyone considers the matter resolved until the next incident occurs. He clicked to the next slide, showing before and after photos of Harmon's Market, from a typical convenience store to a vibrant community hub with financial literacy posters and workshop schedules prominently displayed. But what if we approach these moments differently? What if, instead of simply punishing individual transgressions, we use them as entry points to address the underlying systems that produce them? In the front row, Richard and Zoe Harmon sat alongside Thomas Caldwell and Alicia Reynolds, an unlikely quartet united by their involvement in what had become known as the Roxbury model. Further back, Marcus spotted Elijah, now interning at Callender while attending community college, sitting with Ms. Washington, who had recently closed on her first home. "The program we developed wasn't designed to excuse discrimination," Marcus continued. "Rather, it acknowledged that meaningful accountability requires more than punishment. It demands transformation, not just of individuals, but of access to opportunity itself." As Marcus outlined the program's structure and outcomes, he noticed several audience members taking particularly detailed notes. Representatives from 3 major financial institutions had requested meetings with him after the lecture, intrigued by the potential of replicating the model in other communities. In just 3 months, Marcus reported, over 200 community members have completed financial literacy courses. 34 have opened investment accounts. 17 have begun the process of purchasing homes. 5 have launched small businesses with microloans facilitated through the program. He clicked to a new slide showing the expansion of the initiative. What began in one store has now spread to 7 locations across Boston, each serving as a financial education hub for its neighborhood. The curriculum, developed collaboratively with community input, addresses both practical financial skills and the historical context of economic inequality. As the presentation concluded, Marcus addressed the underlying philosophy that had guided their approach. True corporate social responsibility isn't about damage control or image management. It's about leveraging resources and influence to create sustainable change in collaboration with communities, not simply for them. The question and answer session that followed was robust, with inquiries ranging from implementation challenges to metrics for success. When a student asked about scalability, Marcus deferred to Richard, who had joined him at the podium. "The most critical factor," Richard explained, speaking with the hard-earned authority of experience, "is authenticity. This can't be a top-down initiative where corporations parachute in with pre-packaged solutions. It requires genuine partnership and a willingness to be uncomfortable, to admit mistakes and learn publicly." A distinguished professor raised her hand. "Mr. Wells, While the financial outcomes are impressive, I'm curious about the less quantifiable impacts. How has this initiative affected community perceptions of both Harmon's Market and Calanda Financial? Marcus glanced at Alicia, who stood to address the question. As someone who was initially one of the program's most vocal critics, she admitted, I can speak to this. What changed minds wasn't just the financial education, but the transparency of the process. When Richard publicly acknowledged his biases and committed to addressing them, it opened space for real dialogue. When Calanda committed resources without controlling the narrative, it demonstrated authentic partnership. She paused, looking directly at Marcus. That said, we maintain healthy skepticism. One successful program doesn't erase centuries of systemic inequality or decades of corporate extractive practices, but it does provide a template for what meaningful engagement might look like. As the session concluded, Marcus found himself surrounded by attendees eager to continue the conversation. Among them was James Peterson, the investor whose substantial contribution had helped expand the program beyond its initial location. Remarkable work, Marcus, Peterson said, shaking his hand firmly. When you first pitched me on ethical investing, I was interested, but cautious. Seeing how you've applied those principles in your own backyard, that's what convinced me. Marcus smiled. It's been a team effort, with the community leading the way. As the crowd dispersed, a young black student approached Marcus hesitantly. Mr. Wells, your journey is inspiring to many of us, but I have to ask, don't you ever get tired of turning moments of discrimination into teaching opportunities? Wouldn't it sometimes be easier to just get angry? The question caught Marcus off guard with its directness. He considered it thoughtfully before responding. Of course I get angry, he admitted. Anyone who experiences discrimination does. The difference is in what I choose to do with that anger. He gestured toward the now empty podium. This approach isn't about denying legitimate emotions. It's about channeling them toward lasting change, rather than momentary satisfaction. The student nodded slowly. Thank you for your honesty. Sometimes it feels like successful black professionals are expected to be perpetually gracious educators. That's a burden no one should have to carry, Marcus agreed. Each person must decide for themselves how to respond to injustice. This was my choice for this particular moment, not a prescription for everyone. Later, as the auditorium emptied, Marcus found himself alone with Richard in the quiet space. The two men had developed an unusual relationship, not quite friendship, but a connection forged through their shared journey of the past months. I still think about that day in the store, Richard said, breaking the contemplative silence. How differently things could have gone. Marcus nodded. Pivot points. Life is full of them, moments where everything changes based on a single decision. Your decision, Richard clarified, to build rather than destroy. And yours, Marcus countered, to accept accountability rather than defensiveness. Richard hesitated, then voiced the question that had lingered unspoken between them. After all this time working together, after everything we've built, have you forgiven me, Marcus? Marcus considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Forgiveness suggests that what happened was primarily personal, a harm done to me that I could choose to absolve. But what happened in your store that day wasn't just about me. It reflected patterns that harm entire communities. He met Richard's gaze directly. What matters more than my personal forgiveness is that you've committed to the ongoing work of addressing those patterns. That has value beyond whatever resolution exists between us. Richard absorbed these words thoughtfully. I understand, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to do that work however it came about. As they gathered their materials to leave, Zoe approached with a tablet in hand. Dad, Mr. Wells, I thought you might want to see this. My final feature on the Roxbury model just published in the Boston Globe. The men leaned in to read the headline. From confrontation to collaboration, how one moment of discrimination sparked systemic change. They offered me a permanent position covering community economic development, Zoe added, unable to completely hide her pride. Apparently, stories about solutions are as compelling as those about problems. Congratulations, Marcus said warmly. Your reporting has been essential to this process, holding all of us accountable while documenting the possibilities. Outside the building, they found Sophia waiting with unexpected news. The governor's office called. They want to create a statewide adaptation of the Roxbury model, with potential legislation to incentivize corporate community partnerships focused on economic empowerment. Marcus shook his head in amazement. From a sandwich shop confrontation to potential state policy. I never imagined this trajectory. That's how change often happens, Sophia observed. Not from grand designs, but from authentic responses to specific moments, expanded thoughtfully over time. As they walked across Harvard Yard, Marcus found himself reflecting on his journey, from the scholarship student who'd once felt out of place on this campus to the business leader now being invited to shape policy based on his approach to addressing discrimination. The irony wasn't lost on him that Richard's act of profiling had ultimately created opportunities for hundreds of community members to access financial knowledge previously beyond their reach, not because discrimination was acceptable, but because they had refused to let that moment be defined solely by its harm. 2 weeks later, Marcus returned to the community center where he still taught every Wednesday. The classroom was filled with familiar faces and new ones, all engaged in learning financial concepts that could transform their economic futures. Elijah approached him after class, excitement evident in his expression. "Mr. Wells, I got accepted to the business program at Boston University, and with the scholarship from Calanda, I'll be able to attend without taking on debt." Marcus clasped the young man's shoulder proudly. "That's outstanding, Elijah. You've earned this opportunity." "I've been thinking," Elijah continued, suddenly serious. "After I graduate, I want to come back here, to Roxbury, open a business, create jobs, teach what I've learned, continue the cycle." "That's exactly how sustainable change happens," Marcus affirmed. "Knowledge returning to strengthen the community that nurtured it." As Marcus prepared to leave, he encountered Richard arriving for his turn, teaching the introductory financial literacy class, a role he had gradually grown into over the months, his initial awkwardness replaced by genuine commitment. "Full house tonight?" Marcus asked. Richard nodded. "And a waiting list for the next session. People are hungry for this knowledge. Knowledge that should have been accessible all along," Marcus noted. "Yes," Richard agreed without defensiveness, "one of many systemic failures we're just beginning to address." As they parted ways, Marcus stepped outside to find Thomas waiting by his car. "The board unanimously approved expanding the Roxbury model nationwide," Thomas announced without preamble. "They're allocating $20 million for the first phase, with you directing implementation if you're willing." Marcus leaned against his car, processing the magnitude of this development. From teaching in one classroom to potentially reaching communities across the country, all because you chose an unexpected response to discrimination, Thomas observed. "Most people would have demanded retribution. You built infrastructure instead." "Not instead," Marcus corrected him. Accountability was always part of the equation, but accountability focused on creating change, not just consequences. As Thomas departed, Marcus remained in the parking lot, watching the sunset over Roxbury. The neighborhood where he taught was gradually transforming, not through gentrification that displaced residents, but through economic empowerment that enabled them to build security and wealth while remaining in their community. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, from the young man determined to prove himself at Harvard to the CEO leveraging his position to address systemic inequality. About how a moment that could have ended with anger and retribution had instead catalyzed a movement for economic justice that was now poised to expand nationwide. The sandwich he'd never purchased at Harmon's Market had ultimately led to a feast of opportunities for hundreds of people. Not because discrimination was acceptable, but because they had collectively chosen to transform that painful moment into a foundation for systemic change. As Marcus finally drove away, he reflected on the most important lesson he taught his students, that financial knowledge wasn't just about accumulating wealth, but about creating freedom. The freedom to make choices, to pursue dreams, to build the world you wish to see. In that sense, the Roxbury model represented the ultimate financial literacy lesson, demonstrating how resources, strategically deployed with community partnership, could transform not just individual lives, but entire systems. Not through charity or performative gestures, but through authentic collaboration and shared commitment to sustainable change. And it had all begun with a moment of discrimination in a convenience store, a pivot point that could have led anywhere, but had ultimately come full circle to create opportunities far beyond what anyone could have imagined that day. The end. Dear listeners, we hope Marcus and Richard's journey has touched your heart and perhaps changed your perspective on how we can address discrimination in our society. For more thought-provoking stories that explore complex social issues through compelling narratives, please subscribe to our channel by clicking the button below. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like this video and share it with others who might benefit from its message. Our team works tirelessly to bring you unique stories that challenge conventional thinking and inspire meaningful conversation. Join our community in the comments section. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the Roxbury model and how similar approaches might work in your own communities. Stay tuned for our next story, coming soon.